A Navy SEAL and his loyal German Shepherd are lost in the northern wilderness, as every trace behind them is swallowed by endless white snow. In the freezing silence, it is the dog's instinct that pulls the soldier toward a thin ribbon of smoke, the only sign of life in the vast isolation. Behind the old wooden door stands a weathered old man, and on the horizon, a storm tightening its grip on the sky. When the storm strikes, wind howls as if to tear the small cabin apart, Azul forcing three souls to stand shoulder to shoulder against nature's fury. The old man speaks of a dream once mocked by the entire town. Smirks, shaken heads, and backs turned in disbelief. Yet, in the heart of the storm, when everything trembles, they prove one powerful truth. Faith can stand where doubt collapses. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment, like, and subscribe so we can continue sharing stories that inspire strength and meaning. And now, let's begin the story. Morning in the far north looked innocent in the way a blade can look like a mirror. The world was bright white, stitched to blue, pine needles inked against the sky, yet the cold had a personality. It pressed itself into every seam and zipper and breath, patient as an old god that did not need to raise its voice to be obeyed. Sunlight scattered across the snowfield, as if someone had spilled a handful of glass. It was beautiful enough to make a person forget that beauty could kill. Silas Vance walked through it like a man who had learned not to be impressed. He was 35, built lean and hard, the way disciplined work makes a body, no bulk for vanity, no softness for mercy. His beard was kept close to the skin, more shadow than statement, and the angles of his face looked carved by weather and long decisions. Short, dark hair sat under a knit cap, and his eyes, gray-blue, steady held the quiet focus of someone trained to measure distance without blinking. Even off-duty, he moved as if someone might call go at any moment. At his left, a German shepherd named Hera tracked the world with her nose the way Silas tracked it with his mind. She was 6, sable-coated black and tan braided together in a natural camouflage muscles spring-loaded under thick winter fur. Amber eyes took in everything. Her ears pivoted like radar dishes. She wore a sturdy harness, dark against her coat, and her breath rose in quick plumes as if she were testing the air for secrets. She was not a pet in the decorative sense. She was a companion in the old, honest meaning of the word, one who shared bread, danger, and silence. Silas checked the map again, then the sky, then the path beneath his boots. The trail should have bent east toward the lake, and then dropped into a shallow valley. That was the plan. He had planned things his whole adult life, routes, contingencies, exit points. Her planning had kept him alive. Planning had not kept other people alive. There were names he never spoke anymore. Men who had followed his hand signals into the wrong kind of quiet. The thought arrived like a gust under his collar. Uninvited, then settled. He exhaled slow. "We're still fine," he told Hera, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to her or to whatever in him still carried old alarms. Hera trotted ahead, then stopped so abruptly her claws scraped on crusted snow. She lowered her head, sniffed once, then twice longer the second time, like a reader lingering on a line that didn't make sense. Silas paused. "What is it?" Hera didn't look back. She stared into the trees to the left of the trail, body angled, tail held low but steady. Not fear, not excitement. Something else. A firm, insistent certainty. Silas followed her gaze. Nothing obvious, just pines standing close, their lower branches heavy with powder, the understory clogged with brush, the kind of terrain that swallowed footprints and made directions feel like rumors. He took one step left anyway, then another, and listened. The forest sounded normal, distant caw of a crow, soft tick of ice shedding from needles, the hush of snow absorbing everything else. Still, Hera's posture said the world had shifted. Humor, dry as frozen air, flickered through Silas's mind. Of course the dog knows. Of course the seal with the training and the map is the one guessing. He crouched and ran a gloved hand over the snow near Hera's paws. And beneath the thin crust was a faint depression, as if something had passed here recently. Maybe a deer, maybe a person. Hera sniffed again, then took 2 careful steps forward and stopped, waiting. Silas's chest tightened with something dangerously close to trust. "All right," he murmured. "Lead." They left the trail. The trees closed around them, and the light changed. Sunbeams broke into smaller coins, scattered through branches. The air smelled sharper here, a mix of resin and cold iron. Silas moved with practiced economy, stepping where the snow looked stable, scanning for landmarks, a split trunk, a fallen log, anything to anchor location. The map became less useful with every minute. The compass still pointed true, but North did not care about human intention. Hera moved like she was following a thread no one else could see. Not fast, deliberate. She paused at odd intervals, nose to the wind, then resumed with renewed certainty. Silas noticed her ears tilt toward the horizon, yet toward something beyond the trees, and he felt the faint prickle that came before a storm. After 20 minutes, the forest thinned. And then he saw it. A faint ribbon of smoke, almost shy against the bright sky, rising above the tree line. Silas stopped without meaning to. For a moment he simply stared, as if he'd spotted a myth. Smoke meant heat. Heat meant people. People meant variables, danger, help, questions. Smoke also meant shelter, and shelter meant not freezing. Hera let out a small sound half whine, half huff, and pulled forward as if she'd been waiting for him to catch up to what she already knew. Silas followed the smoke. The cabin appeared like an old thought. Small, squared shoulders, a roof steep enough to shrug off snow. It sat in a clearing where the trees gave it a respectful ring of space. The structure looked patched and practical weathered boards, a door that had been repainted more than once, windows with curtains drawn against the cold. At a narrow chimney exhaled that same thin smoke, steady and calm. A place that had learned how to survive without applause. Silas slowed. He scanned the perimeter. No tracks visible from here. Wind had combed the snow clean. The clearing itself felt held, like the cabin had its own stubborn gravity. Hera's body changed the moment they crossed into the open. Her fur along the spine rose slightly. Not aggression. Attention. She sniffed the air and angled her head toward the door, then toward the darker line of trees behind the cabin. Silas noticed, and the old reflex in him sat up straighter. "Easy," he said softly, though his own hands had already adjusted the strap of his pack. He wasn't armed for war, but he was never unprepared. The habit lived in his bones. He walked up to the steps and listened. Inside, a faint clink metal on metal, then a pause. Whoever lived here had heard them. Whoever. Silas raised a fist and knocked. Firm, but not threatening. The door opened a fraction. A single eye appeared in the gap, pale and sharp, framed by wrinkled skin. Then the door opened wider, and Orville Braddock stepped into view. He was well into his 70s, tall in the way a tree stays tall even when the trunk is old. His shoulders were slightly stooped, but the stoop looked earned rather than weak. A thick gray beard covered most of his face, yet trimmed unevenly like a man who cared more about function than symmetry. His hair, also gray, stuck out from beneath a worn cap as if it had given up on being controlled. He wore a heavy flannel shirt under a faded work jacket, and his hands, big, knotted with age, rested near his sides like tools that had been used a long time and still remembered their purpose. His eyes took in Silas first, down to the boots, up to the posture, then moved to Hera and softened by a fraction. Orville didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched, as if the idea of a dog arriving with a man amused him in a private way. "What's your business?" he asked, voice rough like gravel warmed by sun. Silas kept his stance neutral. "Trail got lost under the snow. Phone's dead. We saw smoke." Orville's gaze held Silas's for a beat too long. Measuring. Weighing. Silas had met this look in other forms, border guards. Elders, men who'd survived enough to treat kindness like an expense. Hera sat down without being told, posture upright, side eyes locked on Orville. The dog's calm was almost formal, like she was introducing herself in a language made of stillness. Orville's eyebrows lifted. "Well, she's got manners." Silas's mouth nearly smiled. Nearly. "She's smarter than me." Orville gave a low grunt that might have been laughter if it had decided to put on its boots. He looked past them toward the trees, then up at the sky. The light had begun to change. The blue seemed less pure, as if something darker was seeping into it, and a line of cloud thin as a scratch at first stretched along the horizon. Silas felt it too, a subtle shift in the air pressure, the way the forest went just a little quieter. Even the sun looked sharper, colder. He chose his words carefully. "I'm not looking for trouble, just a place to stay the night. We'll be gone by morning." Orville studied him again, then Hera, then the empty white clearing that would offer no mercy after dark. A strange tenderness crossed the old man's face, gone quickly, like a candle shielded from wind. "You're not the first lost man the snow has walked to my door," Orville said. "But you're the first one who brought a witness." Silas blinked. "A witness?" Orville nodded toward Hera. "That dog's watching like she's taking notes." Silas let out a quiet breath, half relief, half amusement. "She does that." Orville stepped back, opening the door wider. Warm air slipped out, and carrying the scent of wood smoke and something savory beans, maybe, or stew. The smell hit Silas like a memory of safety he didn't know he still wanted. "Come in," Orville said, "before the cold decides you're part of it." Silas hesitated for a heartbeat, training resisting the idea of stepping into an unknown interior. Then he nodded once and led Hera inside. The cabin was small but orderly. Tools hung on pegs. Firewood was stacked like a promise. A lantern sat on a table. The warmth from the stove gathered in the center of the room and pushed back at the edges where winter waited like a patient creditor. Silas set his pack down, careful not to look too grateful. Hera walked the perimeter slowly, sniffing corners, then returned to stand near the door. She didn't relax. She didn't lie down. She stood like a sentinel dressed in fur. Orville noticed. "She expecting company?" Silas followed Hera's gaze to the door, then to the window. Outside, as the trees swayed faintly, though there was barely wind yet, the cloud line on the horizon thickened, turning the sky the color of old steel. Silas's throat tightened with the kind of unease that came before bad news. "She's sensing something," he said. "She usually doesn't miss." Orville's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He looked at the stove, then at the window, then at Hera again, as if weighing the dog's warning against his own years. "Yeah," Orville said at last, a voice quiet now. "I know that look." He reached over and latched the door with an extra hook, an old habit, performed without drama. Silas watched, and something in him eased, just slightly, not because the hook could stop a storm, but because another human being had taken the warning seriously. Orville turned back toward them. "Make yourselves useful," he said, then added, almost grudgingly, "You'll eat first." Silas nodded, and for a second the cabin felt like a small treaty between strangers. And then Hera's head snapped toward the door so fast her harness straps shifted with a soft rasp. She let out a low growl, not loud, not wild, controlled, and deliberate, like a signal. Silas's body went still. Orville's hand paused mid-reach for a pot. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, the forest made a sound like someone inhaling before a shout. And the cabin, warm and humble, held its breath. The cabin did not shake at once. Storms in the north did not announce themselves with drama. They assembled like a quiet verdict. The sky outside the small window dimmed not into darkness, but into a dense, metallic gray that seemed to press its forehead against the glass. The light thinned, sharpened, then retreated. Snow began as a soft drift, almost tender, before turning into something heavier, more deliberate. Inside, warmth gathered near the iron stove, it radiating in slow pulses that felt almost alive. The air smelled of pine resin, old timber, and simmering beans thickened with salt pork. It was not luxury, but it was real. Solid. The kind of meal built to resist winter rather than impress a guest. Silas removed his gloves carefully and set them near the stove. Never too close. His movements were economical, precise. Each action conscious of space. Even in a stranger's cabin, even off mission, even off, and he operated as if the room were a perimeter to assess. Hera had not relaxed. She stood near the door at first, body angled toward it, ears upright, amber eyes steady. The low growl she had given minutes earlier had not repeated, but it lingered in memory like the echo of something unfinished. Now she paced once along the interior wall, nose hovering inches from the wood, as if reading a script written in scent. Orville Braddock moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had outlived urgency. He ladled stew into 3 mismatched bowls, one chipped at the rim, while one with a faded blue ring, one plain and sturdy. His hands were broad, knuckles enlarged by decades of work. The veins beneath his skin stood out like the roots of an old tree. "Storm's coming fast," he said, voice low and gravel-edged. "Barometer dropped this morning." Silas glanced toward the small shelf above the window. A brass barometer hung there, glass slightly clouded with age. The needle did, indeed, lean toward stormy. "You live alone out here?" Silas asked. Orville gave a short nod. "Been that way a long time?" He did not elaborate. The silence after the sentence felt intentional, not empty. Silas accepted the bowl and nodded his thanks. Steam rose between them. For a brief second, the warmth against his face brought a memory of barracks kitchens overseas, men hunched over metal trays, joking louder than necessary to keep fear small. He pushed the memory aside before it sharpened. Hera approached Orville cautiously as he set a small portion of meat into a tin dish for her. She did not eat immediately. She sniffed his hand first, slow and deliberate. Orville did not flinch. "She's checking you," Silas said quietly. "Good," Orville replied. "World would be better if more folks did that." Hera finally lowered her head and ate, though not greedily. She paused between bites, glancing toward the door each time the wind shifted. The first true gust struck the cabin then. Not violent. Not yet. But firm enough that the structure creaked in response. A long wooden sigh. Silas's spine straightened instinctively. He counted the seconds between gusts. Measured intensity. Listened to the rhythm. Storms, like enemies, had patterns. Orville watched him with faint curiosity. "You military," the old man said, not as a question. Silas's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Navy. Explains the posture?" Silas gave the smallest nod. He did not add the rest that he had been a Navy SEAL, that he had spent years entering hostile places at night, as that he had learned the weight of responsibility the hard way. Those facts did not belong in every room. Outside, the snowfall thickened. The world beyond the window blurred into white streaks, horizontal now, driven by rising wind. Hera's ears twitched. She stood abruptly and moved toward the east wall, the side facing the tree line. She pressed her nose against a narrow seam between boards and inhaled deeply. Silas noticed. "What is it?" he asked softly. Hera let out a soft woof. Not alarmed but alert, Orville's gaze shifted to the same wall. His face changed. Not fear, but calculation. "That side takes the worst of it," he said. "Old pine snapped there 2 winters ago. I braced the frame myself." Another gust hit harder. The cabin shuddered slightly, then steadied. Silas set his bowl aside without finishing. He rose and crossed to the wall Hera was inspecting. He pressed his palm flat against the wood. Cold seeped through instantly. He felt vibration subtle, but present. The storm was building. "You got extra lumber?" Silas asked. Orville nodded toward the back room. "Stacked behind the workbench." Silas moved with swift efficiency. He retrieved 2 solid boards and a small toolkit. He measured the interior frame with his eyes alone, estimating stress points, then positioned the boards vertically along the seam Hera had identified. "Hold this," he said. Orville stepped forward without hesitation. The 2 men worked in silence, one knot hammer strikes sharp against rising wind. Hera paced once, then sat again, watching both men intently. The wind intensified. Snow struck the walls like thrown sand. For a fleeting moment, Silas felt something close to respect. Not for the storm, but for the cabin. It did not protest. It absorbed. It endured. Halfway through securing the second brace, the power flickered. A weak electric bulb hanging above the table blinked twice, then steadied. Orville exhaled through his nose. "Generator's temperamental." As if summoned by the admission, the light cut out entirely. Darkness rushed in, but not complete darkness. The stove's glow remained, painting the room in shifting amber. Shadows climbed the walls like quiet spectators. Silas did not react outwardly, but internally he adjusted. Darkness was not new territory. He knew how to move in it. Orville reached for a lantern, striking a match with slow deliberation. The flame flared, illuminating the ridges of his beard and the lines etched around his eyes. Then, Hera froze. Not in motion, not mid-step. She froze, as if the air itself had hardened around her. Her head turned not toward the braced wall, not toward the door, but toward the ceiling. She stared upward, body rigid. Silas's pulse shifted. He followed her gaze. Nothing obvious. Just wooden beams crossing overhead. And then he heard it. A faint, sharp sound, like the brittle snap of ice splitting. Orville's lantern hand stilled. The sound came again. Not from the walls, from above. Snow accumulation, and the weight of it. Hera barked once sharp, commanding. Silas moved without hesitation. He grabbed his coat and pulled it on in one fluid motion. "Roof," he said. Orville hesitated for half a second, long enough for age to remind him of its presence, then nodded and reached for his own coat. The door opened against a wall of wind. Snow struck Silas's face like thrown gravel. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The world beyond the threshold had transformed into a white roar. Hera lunged forward but remained tethered by discipline. She stayed just within the clearing, scanning. Silas circled the cabin, boots sinking deep. Snow had already gathered heavily along the roof's windward side, forming a thick, dangerous ridge. He climbed the small ladder attached to the back of the structure. Movements steady despite the gale. The wood was slick beneath his gloves. Up top, the wind roared unfiltered. He anchored himself low and began pushing snow over the edge in swift, uncontrolled sweeps. Each shove sent cascades downward, vanishing into the blizzard. Below, Orville stood braced near the ladder, lantern shielded against the wind. His figure looked small beneath the violence of the sky, but unyielding. Hera remained below, eyes tracking Silas with unwavering focus. And in that moment, amid screaming wind and falling snow, Silas felt something shift inside him. Not fear, recognition. This was not combat, not chaos with human intent. This was survival without malice, and it was simpler. He cleared the final ridge and climbed down carefully. The ladder shook once in the wind, but held. Inside again, the cabin felt warmer by contrast. Orville secured the door firmly. He said nothing, but the look he gave Silas carried weight acknowledgement, perhaps gratitude. Hera approached Silas and pressed her forehead briefly against his thigh, a grounding gesture she rarely used. He rested a gloved hand between her ears. "Good catch," he murmured. The storm intensified further. Wind shrieked through the trees. Something heavy crashed in the distance, likely a branch or entire trunk giving way. Inside, the lantern flame wavered. Orville resumed stirring the stew as if routine itself were armor. "First storm's always the test," he said quietly. Silas leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely. He listened to wind, to wood, to breath. Hera finally lay down near the stove, though her head remained raised. For a while, they ate in silence. Outside, winter showed its teeth. Inside, 3 strangers shared heat. The cabin creaked again, but held, and the storm kept speaking its long, relentless language against the walls. Morning did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, like someone lifting a heavy curtain one careful inch at a time. The storm had passed in the night. Not vanished, storms never truly vanished, but moved on with the cold indifference of something that had proved its point. The world outside the cabin window lay buried in fresh snow. smooth and unbroken, reflecting pale gold light from a sun that now seemed almost apologetic. Silas woke before Orville. What years of conditioned vigilance had carved that habit into him deeper than bone. He lay still for a moment on the narrow cot he'd been offered, listening, not for gunfire or distant movement, but for subtler things. The shifting of boards, the wind's leftover sigh, the breathing patterns inside the room. Hera was already awake. She lay near the stove, head lifted, amber eyes alert but calm. The edge from the previous night had softened. She watched Silas rise and stretch, Kiss on her tail giving one measured thump against the floorboards. "You sleep?" he murmured. Her ears flicked as if the question amused her. Orville stirred next, emerging from a small back room with the stiffness of age evident in the way he straightened slowly. In daylight, the old man looked less severe. The lantern glow of the night before had sharpened his features. Morning light revealed something gentler beneath the thick beard and weather-worn skin. His eyes, pale and clear, had carried the fatigue of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking long after others had stopped listening. "Storm didn't take us," Orville said simply. Silas nodded. Cabin held. Orville glanced toward the braced wall Silas had reinforced the night before. He didn't comment, but the look he gave the timber was approving. Breakfast was modest black coffee strong enough to bite, bread warmed on the stove, and leftover stew thickened into something closer to porridge. They ate without urgency, and outside snow sparkled so brightly it seemed unreal. Silas stepped out briefly to assess the clearing. The air felt different washed, clean, almost fragile. The trees stood heavy with white weight but upright. No visible damage in the immediate vicinity. The roof bore the clean lines of freshly shifted snow. Hera followed, nose skimming low across the drifts. She traced wide arcs around the cabin, then veered toward a side structure partially hidden behind stacked firewood. Silas hadn't noticed it the night before, and it was smaller than the cabin more shed than room, its roof sagging slightly under snow. The door was closed, but one hinge hung crooked. Hera paused in front of it. She didn't bark. She didn't scratch. She simply sat, waiting. Silas felt the faint tug of curiosity sharpen into something heavier. He brushed snow from the handle and opened the door. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and old paper. Workbenches lined the walls, cluttered with tools arranged in careful disorder, as nails sorted into jars, wood shavings gathered in shallow piles, and in the far corner, beneath a slanted beam, sat a small wooden ladder leading upward to a narrow loft space. "Workshop," Orville said from behind him. Silas hadn't heard the old man approach. "You build out here?" "Used to," Orville replied. "Still do sometimes." Hera slipped past Silas and climbed halfway up the ladder before stopping. She turned her head back toward him, eyes intent. Silas felt that pull again, the same one from the forest trail. "All right," he muttered. He climbed the ladder. The loft was low, forcing him to crouch. Dust motes floated in the angled sunlight. Several wooden crates sat stacked along the far wall, some open, some sealed. One crate near Hera had its lid slightly ajar. She nudged it gently with her nose. Silas lifted the lid fully. Inside lay a stack of notebooks and a single thick bound manuscript hand-stitched, edges worn. The cover bore no printed title, only handwriting etched in dark ink. Structural observations on spherical dwellings in extreme climates. Silas stilled. He picked it up. The weight of it surprised him. Not physically, but in implication. This was not idle scribbling. This was years. He descended carefully and brought the book into the brighter light of the workshop floor. Orville watched him without interruption. Silas opened to the first page. Diagrams filled the margins' precise arcs, measurements, force vectors, notes scribbled beside them in compact handwriting. Observations about wind dispersion, load distribution, snow accumulation angles. It was meticulous. Silas felt a strange tightening in his chest. "You wrote this," he said quietly. Orville shrugged once, as if that fact were small. "Thought I might?" Silas flipped pages slowly. There were dates spanning decades, early sketches rough and hopeful, later revisions sharper, more resolved. "You planning to build it?" Silas asked. Orville's jaw shifted. "Planned," he corrected. "Long time ago." Silas looked up. Orville's posture changed subtly. Not defensive, not ashamed, but braced against memory. "Town didn't see the point," the old man said. "They said square walls were good enough, said I was chasing storms that hadn't come." Silas closed the book halfway, absorbing that. "And then?" he prompted. Orville's eyes moved toward the open doorway, toward the glittering snow beyond. "Then a storm did come," he said. "Not like last night, worse." He did not elaborate further. Silas didn't press. Instead, he turned another page and froze. Pinned to the inside cover was a photograph. A younger Orville stood beside a woman. She was tall, with dark hair braided over one shoulder, her face strong and expressive. Laugh lines framed her eyes. She wore a heavy coat and leaned slightly toward Orville, as if accustomed to sharing warmth. There was intelligence in her gaze and trust. Silas felt something shift in the air. Hera stepped closer and sniffed the edge of the photograph. Orville's voice softened by degrees. "That was Lillian," he said. "My wife." He didn't need to add more for the weight to land. Silas studied the woman's face briefly before closing the cover respectfully. "You built the cabin together?" he asked. Orville nodded. "Started with the idea of a sphere. Town laughed. So we built square." His eyes flickered with a brief, rueful smile. Silas held the manuscript, thumb resting against the spine. "Why keep writing?" he asked. Orville looked at him then, not past him, not through him. "Because wind doesn't laugh," he said. "It teaches." Silas felt that sentence settle somewhere deep. He had known men who taught through force, through loss, through silence. Wind, apparently, did the same. Hera suddenly moved away from them. She walked to the far side of the workshop and stopped in front of a tarp-covered shape leaning against the wall. She stood there longer than necessary. Her tail did not wag. Her ears remained forward. Slowly, deliberately, she placed one paw against the tarp and pressed. Silas exchanged a glance with Orville. Orville hesitated. Then, with visible reluctance, he crossed the floor and pulled the tarp aside. Beneath it stood a wooden frame, curved, incomplete, but unmistakably spherical in intention. A partial dome. Perfect arcs intersecting with careful precision. Silas stared. Even unfinished, it was elegant, balanced. The geometry itself seemed to resist collapse. Hera stepped inside the hollow curve and turned once, as if testing the space. Then she sat at its center. Not randomly. Centered. Silas felt something tighten in his throat. Orville looked at the frame as if at a ghost that had returned politely. "She always did like the model," he murmured, though it wasn't clear whether he meant Hera or Lillian. The workshop fell silent except for distant, dripping snow. Silas ran his hand along one of the curved beams. The wood felt solid, intentional. "You could finish it," he said quietly. Orville gave a small shake of his head. "No one wants it." Silas met his eyes. "That's not the same as no one needing it." The sentence hung between them. Outside, sunlight continued to brighten the snowfield, indifferent to human doubt. Hera remained seated within the skeletal dome, posture calm but resolute. Silas closed the manuscript carefully and placed it back atop the crate. He did not promise anything, but something inside him, long rigid, long disciplined into caution, shifted a fraction. The idea of building something that resisted wind not through force but through design. It spoke to him. Storms were inevitable. Collapse was not. Orville replaced the tarp slowly, though his gaze lingered on the frame. "Breakfast's getting cold," he muttered. Silas nodded, though his thoughts remained upstairs among curved beams and unmocked mathematics. As they stepped back toward the cabin, Hera paused once more at the workshop threshold. She looked back at the hidden dome, then at Silas, and for a fleeting second it felt less like coincidence and more like direction. The road into town had been plowed, but only just. Snowbanks rose on either side like pale barricades, the sun striking their surfaces until they glittered almost cheerfully. The air carried that strange brightness that follows a storm, sharp, metallic, deceptively clean. It made the world look forgiven. Silas walked beside Orville along the narrow path leading from the cabin toward the main road. Hera moved slightly ahead, nose low, tail level, scanning without hurry. As the snow beneath her paws compacted in soft crunches, rhythmic and steady, they had decided to make the walk for supplies, coffee, lamp oil, a few extra fasteners. Orville said he was running low on. Nothing dramatic, nothing symbolic. But as the town's rooftops came into view, something shifted in Orville's posture. It was subtle. His shoulders, already bent slightly with age, drew inward by a fraction. His steps slowed just enough to register hesitation. Silas noticed. The town lay in a shallow valley, buildings clustered close together against the cold. Wooden storefronts painted in muted colors lined the main road. A hardware store with a hand-lettered sign, a diner with fogged windows, a church steeple rising modestly, not ambitious enough to challenge the sky. It was a town built on endurance rather than imagination. Hera paused at the edge of the street and glanced back at Silas as if confirming his awareness. "Easy," he murmured. And a pickup truck rattled past, tires grinding over packed snow. The driver, a broad man with a heavy brown beard and ruddy cheeks, slowed as he recognized Orville. The truck stopped. The man leaned out the window. "Still upright, Braddock?" he called, voice loud and edged with amusement. Orville gave a short nod. "Cabin's tougher than you think, Eli." Eli Rourke climbed out of the truck. He was in his early 40s, thick through the shoulders, wearing a flannel jacket stretched tight across his frame. His beard was trimmed but full, the kind worn by men who favored tradition over novelty. His eyes were a sharp gray, quick to judge, and quicker to dismiss. There was confidence in him, earned, perhaps, but also something brittle beneath it. He walked with the swagger of someone accustomed to being heard in small rooms. He looked Silas over in one sweeping glance. "And who's this?" Eli asked. "Just passing through," Silas replied evenly. Eli's gaze shifted to Hera. "She bite?" he asked. "Only if she needs to," Silas answered. Eli snorted lightly, amused more by the tone than the words. "Town's still standing," he said. Storm wasn't much. Orville didn't respond immediately. He watched Eli with a gaze that held no anger, no resentment, just a quiet assessment. Was enough, Orville said at last. Eli shrugged. Square walls do the job? The comment landed heavier than its casual delivery suggested. Silas felt the undercurrent but said nothing. A door down the street opened, and a woman stepped out into the cold light. Mara Keene. She was in her early 30s, tall and lean, wearing a forest green rescue jacket with reflective stripes faded from use. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight braid, strands escaping in the wind. Her face carried sharp lines, not from age but from responsibility. Freckles dotted her pale skin, and her eyes, an intense blue, missed little. She walked with purpose. "Morning," she called. Eli gave a half-wave. Mara's gaze lingered briefly on Silas before shifting to Hera. "Beautiful dog," she said. Hera met her eyes steadily, but did not approach. "Search and rescue?" Silas asked, nodding toward Mara's jacket. "Volunteer lead," she replied. "We check on folks after storms." Her eyes returned to Orville. "You all right?" she asked him directly. "I manage," Orville answered. There was history in the exchange. Not hostile, not warm, but layered. Silas sensed it the way he sensed wind before it arrived. Eli shifted his weight. "Braddock still sketching his snow globes?" he said lightly. The word snow globes carried a subtle sting. Mara's expression tightened. Orville remained composed. "Still studying structure," he corrected. Eli laughed once, not cruelly, but dismissively. "Town doesn't need fancy curves," he said. "We need roofs that don't fall in." Silas felt the urge to respond, "rise," and chose to let it pass. Conflict here was old soil. It did not need fresh seed. Hera, however, had stiffened. Not toward Eli, toward the alley behind the diner. Her ears snapped forward, her head tilted slightly. Silas followed her gaze. Nothing obvious. Just a narrow space between buildings where snow had drifted unevenly. Then Hera moved, not abruptly, not alarmed, deliberately. She walked toward the alley. Silas's breath slowed. Mara noticed the shift. "Something wrong?" she asked. Silas didn't answer. Hera disappeared briefly into the narrow passage. A moment later, she barked. Sharp. "Oh, once!" Silas was already moving. He reached the alley just as Mara followed close behind. Behind stacked crates and a tilted trash bin lay a teenage boy tangled in a loose coil of wire fencing. Snow had drifted over his boots, half burying them. His face was pale beneath freckles, brown hair matted to his forehead. He looked about 16. His name, as Silas would soon learn, was Noah Pike. He was thin, all limbs and restless energy, wearing a jacket too light for the season. His breath came fast. I panicked. I dropped my book," Noah stammered as Silas knelt to untangle the wire from his ankle. "Didn't see the drift." Silas worked calmly, hands efficient. "Stay still," he said. Noah obeyed instantly. Mara crouched beside them. "You should know better," she scolded gently. "Storm just passed." Noah nodded, embarrassment flushing his cheeks. Hera stood over him, sniffing carefully, as if ensuring no injury had been missed. Once freed, Noah stood shakily. He looked at Orville, who had remained at the mouth of the alley. "Morning, Mr. Braddock," Noah said softly. Orville inclined his head. Noah's eyes shifted to Silas. You military? He asked with open curiosity. Silas hesitated a beat. Something like that. Noah's gaze brightened. Not idolizing, but intrigued. Eli had followed them halfway, arms crossed. Kid needs to watch where he's going, he muttered. As Noah brushed snow from his coat, something slipped from his pocket, and a folded sheet of paper. It landed open at Silas's feet. He glanced down. It was a rough sketch. Curved lines, intersecting arcs. A dome. Silas looked at Noah. You draw this? He asked quietly. Noah nodded, suddenly shy. I found some old diagrams in the library, he said. Didn't know who wrote them. Orville's breath caught, not audibly, but visibly in the tightening of his jaw. Mara noticed. Eli rolled his eyes. Kid's got too much imagination, Eli said. Noah picked up the paper quickly, folding it again as if ashamed. Silas felt something steady settle inside him. Wind did not laugh. People did. And sometimes that mattered more. He handed the paper back to Noah. Imagination builds things, Silas said evenly. Noah's eyes flickered with something close to relief. The moment passed without further comment. But it lingered. They walked to the hardware store together after that. Orville slightly behind, as if measuring the distance between past and present. Inside, the store smelled of oil and pine. Shelves carried bolts, tools, rope, the practical vocabulary of the town. Eli resumed casual conversation with the clerk. Mara excused herself to check on another house. Noah lingered near Orville. You ever build it? He asked quietly. Orville studied the boy's face earnest, unguarded. Not yet, he said. Noah nodded slowly, as if that answer held possibility rather than defeat. And Silas purchased the fasteners and lamp oil without ceremony. Outside again, the sun dipped lower. The town looked peaceful, square, predictable. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Silas sensed it in Orville's slower breathing, in Noah's guarded excitement, in the way Mara had watched the exchange without interruption. Hera walked at Silas's side as they turned back toward the road leading to the cabin. Her pace was steady, her gaze forward. Silas glanced back once. Eli stood near his truck, arms folded, expression unreadable. Not hostile. Not convinced. Just waiting. The road back to the cabin stretched white and quiet before them. Snow crunched beneath boots, and the idea of curves of structures that did not fight wind but redirected it remained quietly alive between them. The sun returned with a kind of defiance. 2 days after their walk into town, the sky stretched wide and almost arrogantly blue above the clearing. Snow still covered the ground in smooth white fields, but the light had changed. It no longer felt metallic. It felt temporary. Silas stood in the workshop doorway, sleeves rolled despite the cold. His breath rose in steady clouds as he examined the wooden frame that had once been hidden beneath tarp and hesitation. Orville stood beside him, and hands resting on his hips. In daylight, the unfinished spherical structure looked less like an abandoned dream and more like a blueprint, waiting for courage. Curved ribs arched upward in precise intervals, intersecting in a geometry that felt deliberate rather than decorative. It's solid, Silas said, running his hand along one of the beams. Orville gave a slow nod. Mathematically. Silas glanced at him. Math doesn't build things, Silas said. No, Orville agreed quietly. People do. They had not spoken directly about building it since returning from town. The idea had hovered between them like breath in cold air, visible, unclaimed. Hera circled the structure once before stepping inside the frame. She lowered her head and inhaled, as if memorizing the space. Her posture was alert, but calm. She was not reacting to threat. She was recognizing potential. Silas crouched near the base, measuring angles with his eyes. He had built many things in his life, temporary shelters, on fortified positions, plans designed to withstand chaos. But this felt different. This was not about holding ground. It was about shaping it. Footsteps approached from the road. Silas stood instinctively. Mara Keene entered the clearing first, walking briskly despite the snow. Her rescue jacket caught the sunlight, reflective stripes flashing briefly. Her braid swung against her shoulder as she surveyed the workshop and then the structure within. Behind her came Noah Pike, thinner than his oversized coat suggested, carrying a small toolbox with visible pride. His cheeks were pink from cold and anticipation. And further back, hesitating near the tree line, was Eli Rourke. He had removed his heavy flannel jacket, revealing broad shoulders beneath a plain thermal shirt. His beard was neatly trimmed today, as if he had made an effort without admitting it. His eyes scanned the workshop with open skepticism, but he had come. Jim Orville stepped forward. "You didn't have to," he said. Mara shrugged lightly. "Town council's not meeting on a Tuesday morning. Figured I'd check in." Noah shifted from foot to foot. "I brought screws," he said. Eli crossed his arms but did not speak immediately. Silas studied the group. Different ages, different doubts. Same valley. "Wind doesn't care what shape a building is," Eli said finally. "If it's strong enough, it'll tear it apart." Silas nodded once. "That's true," he said. "But some shapes make wind work harder." Eli's eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't confrontation. It was consideration. They began without ceremony. Orville directed the placement of additional ribs along the existing curve, voice steady and precise. His hands trembled occasionally, not from uncertainty, but age. But when he demonstrated a joint angle, it was exact. Silas handled heavier beams, his movements efficient and economical. He secured braces, tightened fasteners, adjusted alignments. Mara observed at first, then stepped forward without asking, holding sections steady as screws bit into wood. She worked with controlled strength, used to lifting and stabilizing under pressure. Noah passed tools eagerly, listening more than speaking. His eyes shone whenever Orville explained load distribution or snow-shedding angles. Eli lingered near the entrance. He did not help, but he did not leave. Hours passed in measured labor. Sunlight streamed through the open workshop doors, illuminating the skeletal dome as it grew more complete. The structure began to look less theoretical and more inhabitable. Hera remained near the perimeter, occasionally stepping inside, then out again. She seemed to be mapping it in her own way. By midday, the lower hemisphere was nearly reinforced. Silas stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "It'll need anchoring deeper into ground," he said. Orville nodded. "I was planning that." Mara glanced toward the sky. A faint haze had begun to form near the horizon. Silas noticed, too. The air carried a thin edge, almost imperceptible, but familiar. Not immediate danger. Not yet. But movement. Hera suddenly stiffened. Not toward the sky, not toward the forest, toward the town. her body aligned perfectly with the distant valley, ears locked forward, tail rigid. She let out a low, sustained whine, not fear, not aggression, something else. Silas felt the shift instantly. He stepped beside her and followed her line of sight. The town lay quiet in the distance, rooftops catching sunlight. Nothing visibly wrong. No smoke, no commotion. But Hera did not move. She stood as if listening to something beyond human range. Mara's expression sharpened. "You feel that?" she asked softly. Silas nodded once. He did not explain how he felt it. Pressure change, wind direction, instinct honed in other climates. Eli looked between them, unease creeping into his posture. Forecast said clear for 3 days, he muttered. Orville did not respond. He watched Hera instead. The moment stretched. Then Hera relaxed slightly. The whine faded. She stepped back into the workshop, but not fully at ease. The silence left behind felt heavier than before. Work resumed, but the mood had changed. Silas noticed it in the way Eli now stepped closer, inspecting the base joints. In the way Mara checked her phone for updated forecasts. In the way Noah glanced frequently toward the valley. By late afternoon, the dome's framework stood nearly complete. Curves intersected overhead in clean arcs. The structure cast a circular shadow on the snow, elegant and strange against the square lines of the cabin. Orville stepped inside it slowly. He stood at its center, turning in a full circle. For a fleeting second, the old man looked younger, not in body, but in spirit. "This is what I meant," he said quietly. No one laughed. Eli exhaled through his nose. Still looks like a snow globe," he said. But the edge was softer now. Silas crouched near the anchoring points and began driving stakes deep into frozen ground. The effort required force and patience. Each strike echoed sharply. The sky shifted subtly again, clouds gathering in thin streaks, barely noticeable unless one was looking for them. Mara approached Silas. "You think we'll need this soon?" she asked. Silas paused before answering. "I think wind doesn't wait for consensus," he said. She absorbed that. Noah stepped inside the dome, looking up at the intersecting ribs overhead. "It feels safe," he said. Orville studied him. "It will be," he replied. Hera entered next, circling once before lying down near the center. Her posture was alert but grounded, as if claiming the space. Silas straightened and looked at the group. Different doubts still existed. But something had shifted. They were no longer building an idea. They were building contingency. The sun dipped lower, light turning amber. Eli finally picked up a hammer and approached one of the side braces. "Show me where you want it," he said. Orville's eyes flickered with something close to gratitude, but he kept his voice steady. "Right there," he instructed. The sound of hammer strikes resumed. Not frantic, not desperate, deliberate. As the last beam was secured for the day, the dome stood incomplete but unmistakably present, a shape that resisted corners. The valley below remained quiet, but the air carried that thin, tightening note once more. Silas met Hera's gaze. She held it. No panic, just awareness. And beneath the widening sky, in sunlight that felt almost generous, they built something that did not challenge the wind but prepared for it. The second storm did not wait for permission. It arrived in the early hours before dawn, when the world is most vulnerable to surprise. The sky had been clear at sunset, thin streaks of cloud, nothing more, but sometime in the night, the wind turned without warning. By the time Silas opened his eyes, the cabin walls were already speaking in low, stressed murmurs. He was awake before the first real impact. Not because of sound, because of pressure. There is a moment before disaster when the air feels heavier, like a held breath stretching too long. Silas had felt it in deserts before sandstorms, in coastal cities before hurricanes, and now here, deep in northern winter. Hera was already on her feet. She stood near the door, body angled outward, muscles taut beneath her sable coat. Her amber eyes did not carry fear. They carried urgency. Silas rose without hesitation. Outside, the wind roared not sharp like the first storm, but sustained. A deep, relentless. Snow moved horizontally in thick sheets, reducing visibility to a matter of feet. The valley beyond the clearing had vanished behind a white veil. Orville stepped from his back room, fully dressed, as if he'd expected this. "I thought we had another day," Mara's voice cut through the wind as she pushed through the cabin door. She was flushed from exertion, braid loosened by the gale. Snow clung to her jacket in wet clumps. Behind her came Noah, eyes wide but determined, a breath ragged from the uphill sprint. Eli arrived moments later, pulling the door closed hard behind him. His usual swagger had vanished. His face was tight, beard crusted with ice. "It's worse down there," Eli said, voice strained. Roof peeled off the pike shed, trees snapping. Silas didn't waste time on reaction. "Shelter," he said simply. They all knew what he meant. The dome. Wind battered them as they moved toward the workshop. Snow lashed exposed skin like handfuls of needles. Hera ran slightly ahead, but stayed within sight, weaving through drifts with controlled speed. The dome stood half-shadowed in white chaos, its curved frame catching snow but not collapsing under it. The anchoring stakes held firm. Silas opened the side entry they had reinforced and gestured for everyone to move inside. The difference was immediate. Inside the spherical frame, wind did not vanish, but it changed. It curved around them, slipping along the exterior ribs rather than striking flat surfaces. Snow gathered unevenly, but slid off in slow cascades. Mara's eyes widened. "Feels different," she said, almost to herself. Orville stepped to the center and braced one hand against a rib beam. He closed his eyes briefly, not in prayer, but in measurement. "It's distributing the load," he said quietly. More figures emerged through the white beyond the clearing. 2 older women, bundled in heavy coats, and faces tight with cold and fear. The first was Mrs. Clara Dennings, nearly 70, small in stature, but rigid in pride. Her silver hair escaped beneath a knitted hat. She had lived in town her entire life and had once openly dismissed Orville's round foolishness at a council meeting years ago. Now she clutched the arm of the second woman, Esther Boyd, a broader figure with kind eyes and trembling hands. Esther had lost her husband to a winter accident decades prior. Storms unsettled her deeply. When Hera moved toward them without barking, she approached low and calm, guiding them inward with a nudge of her shoulder against Clara's leg. Silas noticed that detail. Hera was not reacting to noise or panic. She was managing it. Soon the shelter held more than just builders. Families, children. An elderly man named Walter Griggs with a cane and frost-bitten fingertips. A mother clutching a toddler wrapped in blankets. The air inside the dome grew warm with shared breath. Wind screamed outside, but inside it moved like a current around a stone. A violent crack split the air. Not from the dome, from the direction of town. Mara froze. "That's the old church steeple," she whispered. Eli's face went pale. For a heartbeat, the group considered rushing back. Silas stepped to the dome's entrance and peered through swirling white. Visibility. Near zero. Movement outside would be blind. He turned back slowly. "We hold," he said. Mara's jaw clenched, but she nodded. And then Hera stiffened again. Not toward town, toward a mound of snow pressed hard against one side of the dome. She barked, short, urgent. Silas moved instantly. A child, Noah, had stepped closer to that side, drawn by the sound. Beneath the weight of accumulating snow, one exterior rib had begun to bow slightly, not breaking, but strained. Silas and Eli moved together without speaking. They reinforced the joint from inside, bracing it with spare lumber stored along the interior wall. Orville directed them calmly, voice steady even as wind roared outside. "Angle it there. Let it transfer down, not inward." They worked in tight coordination. Hera remained beside Noah, body positioned between him and the wall. When the reinforcement locked into place, the rib steadied. Snow continued to slide. The dome held. The crack of the church steeple faded into distance beneath the storm's roar. No one spoke for several seconds. Inside the curved shelter, fear shifted into something else, an understanding. Mara met Orville's gaze across the circle. There was no laughter now, no dismissive tone, only acknowledgement. Hours passed in suspended tension. Snow continued to hammer the valley. Occasionally someone wept quietly. A child whimpered. Clara Dennings muttered fragments of prayer under her breath. Hera moved between people, checking them as if conducting silent roll call. Silas crouched near the entrance, scanning for structural shifts. Eli stood near him now, not across, not apart. "Didn't think curves mattered," Eli muttered under his breath. Silas glanced at him. "They don't," he said evenly. "Until they do." Eli huffed something like reluctant agreement. Outside, the storm reached its peak, a sustained roar that seemed less weather and more force. But the dome did not resist violently. It redirected. Wind slipped around it. Snow flowed downward instead of piling high against flat walls. But when at last the intensity lessened gradually, almost imperceptibly, the sound softened from roar to howl to whisper. Silence did not fall at once. It returned cautiously. Mara was the first to step toward the entrance. Silas stopped her gently. "Wait," he said. They listened. No cracking timber. No immediate collapse. Only wind fading into distance. Silas opened the entry. Light poured in, white and blinding. The town beyond looked changed, roofs partially torn, a shed flattened, the church steeple indeed broken, its top half lying in a drift. But the dome stood untouched. Snow curved cleanly around it. Clara Dennings stepped outside slowly, eyes wide. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the damage. Then she looked back at Orville. Her lips trembled, not from cold. "I was wrong," she said. Simple. Unadorned. Orville did not smile. He only nodded once. Inside the dome, warmth lingered. Shared. Noah stood near the center, staring upward at the intersecting beams. "Oh, it worked," he whispered. Silas felt something settle inside him, a weight he had carried for years shifting slightly. He had once led men into chaos, believing strength meant facing it head-on. Now he understood something different. Strength could also mean shaping space, so chaos had nowhere to strike. Hera stepped into the sunlight and shook snow from her coat, droplets scattering like sparks. She lifted her head toward the clearing, alert but calm. The mountain had knocked, and the dome had answered. And the valley, for the first time, had listened. Mourning after destruction is not loud. It is meticulous. The valley did not wake all at once. It revealed itself gradually as the sun lifted first the broken lines of rooftops beneath drifts, then the tilted silhouette of the church where the steeple had snapped, then the collapsed shed near the Pike property. Snow still gleamed with deceptive beauty, catching light, as if the night had not tried to tear everything apart. The dome stood in the clearing like a thought that refused to be dismissed. Its curved ribs were dusted with white, but unwarped. The anchoring stakes remained embedded in frozen earth. Inside, the warmth of shared breath had long dissipated, but the memory of it lingered. Silas stepped out before the others. He did not rush. He surveyed. It was instinct more than habit now, an internal scan for immediate threats, structural shifts, secondary collapse. His gray-blue eyes moved with steady calculation. The storm had carved the valley but spared its center. Hera followed at his side, paws silent against crusted snow. Her coat caught the morning light, black and tan threads woven tight with muscle beneath. She moved without tension today. No rigid posture, no forward-leaning urgency. She was calm. Orville emerged slowly from the cabin, pausing briefly at the threshold. He removed his cap and ran a hand through thin gray hair flattened by age and cold. His beard caught frost crystals, turning silver in the sun. He did not look triumphant. Yes, he looked reflective. Clara Dennings approached first from the town road, her small frame bundled tightly in a heavy wool coat. Her steps were cautious, but deliberate. Snow clung to the hem, and her gloved hands trembled slightly, not from cold alone. She stopped a few feet from Orville, her chin lifted not proudly, but honestly. "I should have listened," she said. Her voice did not break, but it thinned. Orville regarded her without resentment. The lines in his face deepened in the light, but his eyes softened. "Storm doesn't wait for opinions," he replied gently. Clara nodded once, accepting both correction and grace. Behind her came Eli Rourke. He walked slower than usual, boots crunching with each step. His flannel coat hung open, revealing a broad chest rising with heavier breaths than normal. His beard was clean but uncombed, and there was something stripped from his posture. No swagger, no casual dismissal. But he stopped near the dome and ran his hand across one of its curved beams. "Didn't lose a nail," he muttered. Silas watched him carefully. Eli exhaled through his nose. "Guess curves do matter," he said. There was no humor in it this time. Mara arrived next, clipboard in hand, braid undone and replaced with a knit cap. She had spent the early hours checking houses, marking safe structures, noting losses. Her face bore fatigue, but also something steadier. She approached Orville and extended her hand. "Town's going to need a new emergency plan," she said. "I'd like your help drafting it." Orville stared at her for a beat. He had spent years dismissed as impractical. Now he was being invited to guide. He took her hand. "I'll help," he said simply. Noah Pike stood a short distance away, watching the exchange with open admiration. He held his sketch pad under one arm, pages curling in the cold air. His eyes, bright and unguarded, reflected not shock but confirmation. As Silas moved toward the edge of the clearing, scanning the valley once more, he had come here by accident. That fact settled differently now. He remembered another valley years ago, another mission shaped by urgency and flawed structure. Men had moved into chaos believing bravery alone would hold. It hadn't. He had carried that failure quietly. Now he stood inside a space shaped by foresight instead of force. Hera walked beside him and sat. Her gaze rested not on the dome, but on him. Silas knelt and pressed his forehead briefly against hers. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to others. But in that moment, a load shared instead of resisted. Hera nudged his chest gently. And for the first time in years, he did not feel like he was bracing against something invisible. He felt aligned. The re-hook did not reveal a new threat. It revealed a shift. Silas rose slowly. Eli approached him, rubbing the back of his neck in an unfamiliar gesture of humility. "Town council's meeting tonight," Eli said. "We're revisiting some ideas." Silas nodded. "Good," he replied. Mara turned toward the valley. "We'll need materials," she said aloud. "Reinforcement. Maybe more than one shelter." Her tone carried resolve. Orville glanced at the workshop, then at the dome. "This was just a model," he said. Clara overheard and shook her head firmly. "Not anymore," she said. People began moving, clearing debris, checking neighbors, salvaging what they could. The air buzzed with activity, not panic, but purpose. Walter Griggs, leaning on his cane, approached the dome carefully. His weathered face creased into a smile that showed missing teeth. "Reminds me of the old grain silos," he said. "Round things always held better." Noah grinned. "Maybe we build more," he said. Orville studied the boy for a long second. "Maybe we do," he replied. Silas felt his phone vibrate faintly in his pocket. He stepped aside to check it. Signal had returned, weak but present. A message blinked on screen. "Deployment briefing update. Northern region assistance requested." He stared at it. Wind moved lightly through the clearing. Nothing violent now. Just a reminder. He looked at Hera. Her ears lifted slightly, sensing the shift in him before he spoke. Silas pocketed the phone. He walked back toward Orville. "Storms don't stop," he said quietly. Orville nodded. "No," he agreed. "But we can prepare." Silas looked around at the valley damaged but standing. "I may have to go," he said. Orville regarded him without surprise. "Figured you might," he said. Whilst there was no disappointment in the old man's voice, only understanding. Mara approached them, catching only the end of the exchange. "You leaving?" she asked. Silas hesitated. "For a bit," he said, "but I know where this is now." He gestured subtly toward the dome. Hera moved to stand at his side. Noah stepped closer. "You'll come back?" he asked. Silas met the boy's eyes. "Build it strong," he said. "So I have something to come back to." Noah nodded solemnly. Clara returned to her house with steadier steps than before. Eli headed toward town hall without needing to be asked. Mara began drafting notes. Orville remained in the clearing a moment longer. He rested his palm against one curved beam. "Wind teaches," he murmured. Silas turned once more toward the valley. He had come here by accident. He would leave by choice. Hera trotted ahead toward the road, glancing back once to ensure he followed. Behind them, the dome caught sunlight cleanly, casting a round shadow on snow that no longer looked fragile. The wind had passed. What remained was not just wood and stakes, it was understanding. And the valley, for the first time in years, had curved itself toward resilience. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as flashes of light or voices from the sky. Sometimes they arrive as quiet wisdom placed in the hands of ordinary people. A curved beam instead of a flat wall. A warning sensed by a loyal dog before the storm is visible. A second chance to build something stronger than what fear once allowed. God does not always calm the storm. Sometimes He teaches us how to stand within it. In our daily lives, we face winds that do not come with weather forecasts. Or financial strain, broken relationships, regret, grief, doubt. We try to stand firm with square walls, pride, denial, isolation, only to discover that strength is not always about resisting. Sometimes it is about reshaping our hearts so pressure can pass without breaking us. The miracle in this story was not just survival, it was transformation. A hardened man learning that protection can be designed. A town learning that humility can save lives. And an old dream resurrected at the exact moment it was needed. Perhaps that is how God works most often. Not by removing difficulty, but by planting ideas, people, and even faithful animals in our path at precisely the right time. If this story touched you, let it be more than entertainment. Share it with someone who may be standing in their own storm. Leave a comment about the moment that moved you most, or the lesson you are carrying into your own life. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that remind us of courage, redemption, and faith. May God bless you and your household. May He strengthen your foundations, guide your decisions, and turn every storm in your life into a lesson that builds something lasting.